Where do you find your confidence? There are so many places that we as humans put our confidence. Maybe it's good looks, maybe it's a great sense of humor, maybe it's being funny or doing really well on the field in sports, maybe it's getting good grades. We tend to put our confidence in so many places. I know for me, it tends to be accomplishments. Have I worked hard? Have I proved myself and proved my worth by doing something awesome? You know, it's so tempting to find those sources of confidence. Well, we're continuing in Philippians. We're getting into chapter 3 today. And what we see here is that Paul is challenging us. We should not place our confidence in ourselves. Instead, our cry as Christians should be that all I have is Christ. All of my confidence, all of my hope is found in Jesus. So go ahead and turn to chapter 3 in Philippians. Take a minute, pause the video, and read verses 1 through 11 real quick. As you dive into these verses, Paul gives us 3 reasons that our confidence should be in Jesus and not in ourselves. The first one we see is in verses 1 through 3. Paul tells us that true faith is worship, not works. So Paul gives this warning in the first verse: watch out for those who mutilate the flesh. Those who mutilate the flesh. So there were a lot of teachers in the early church who were insisting that new believers coming from a non-Jewish background had to follow the Old Testament law, specifically with circumcision. But Paul said, no, we're not trying to earn our way into God's people by our works, by something like circumcision. Instead, we are God's people because we worship Him. We follow Him. And so Paul tells us that as God's people, there are 3 things that define us. First off, we worship by the Spirit. So we worship in the Spirit. He tells us that we glory in Christ Jesus. That's another thing that makes us one of God's people. And lastly, we put no confidence in the flesh. And that's where he really unpacks from here, is by teaching us that it is not about trusting in me, putting my confidence in what I've done. Instead, it's about placing my confidence in Jesus. The next thing that Paul gets into in verses 4 through 6 is he tells us when it comes to placing our confidence in Christ, it's that none of us will ever be as good as Paul. Verses 4 through 6, Paul goes on this rant where he gives us a list that if we knew the Old Testament background, basically we would know he's saying, I'm kind of a big deal. Basically, Paul was the best Jew he could possibly be when it came to the Old Testament law. He did everything right. And because of that, for a long time, he placed his faith in his works and in the things he did to earn his righteousness before God. But as he keeps going through this passage, he sees and eventually tells us, you know what? My faith and my confidence cannot be found in the things that I do. They'll never be enough. Now, for you and me, I wonder how often are we, just like Paul, trying to give this huge list of accomplishments and say, this is why I have confidence. You know, what makes someone a good person today? What do you think of? Maybe you think of someone who makes good grades, someone who works hard in their job or does good work at school. But the important thing for us to think about is what makes us righteous before God is not our works, but it is our faith in Him. So as we look at this big list, I wonder, are we placing our confidence in the wrong things? Are we like Paul, placing our confidence in works? The last point that Paul gives us in this passage about finding hope in Jesus as all that we have is that we need to stop believing in ourselves and start experiencing true life in Jesus. So after Paul's gone over this whole list of everything he has accomplished, all of his good works, he turns now to where he compares them. He says, all of these works I did, they're garbage, they're nothing, they're worthless in comparison to what I can have in Jesus. And so Paul says he lets go of all of those works. He stops trusting in himself, stops believing in himself, and instead starts experiencing true life in Jesus. You see, there's a great hope that we see in these verses that our righteousness can only come by faith in Jesus. And it's given to us from God. It's a free gift. It's not something we earn through our works, but it is by trusting in Jesus, coming to Him and saying, I'm going to stop trying to earn my salvation by my works. Instead, I'm going to run to You. My faith is in You, Jesus, that my righteousness has to come from You. So as we think about how this passage should impact our lives, we've seen the gospel. Now we start to think, how does this transform who I am today? So what I want you to walk away with, thinking about your life, is what are you trusting in? Where are you finding your confidence? And so often it's placed in my works, what I do. Instead, how can you place it in Jesus? Find confidence in what Jesus has done for you, and let that be the foundation you stand on. So my challenge to you today is that you'll begin to let go of trusting in your own works and come to Jesus as the source of your confidence. Thanks for tuning in. Look forward to seeing you guys again.